In 1983, in the USSR, a country of total secrecy and scientific ambition, a laboratory working on antimatter suddenly disappeared. This mysterious episode gave rise to dozens of myths, rumors, and conspiracy theories that live on to this day. What was hidden behind the walls of Soviet scientific centers? Why did the story of the laboratory's disappearance become one of the most enduring legends of the era? Today, we will explore how scientific myths are born and live on, and why it is important to distinguish fact from fiction when it comes to the mysteries of Soviet science. In the world of science, there are topics that are always shrouded in mystery and intrigue. One such topic is antimatter. What is it? Why is there so little of it in the universe? And why are scientists around the world spending enormous amounts of time and money studying it? In 1928, British physicist Paul Dirac predicted the existence of a particle that would be an exact copy of an electron, but with the opposite charge. This gave rise to the idea of antimatter, a substance consisting of antiparticles, like a mirror image of ordinary matter. In 1932, the existence of the anti-electron, or positron, was confirmed experimentally, and this marked the beginning of a new era in physics. Since then, scientists have discovered more and more antiparticles, antiprotons, antineutrons, and then entire atoms of antihydrogen. It would seem that if every particle has an antiparticle, then there should be equal amounts of matter and antimatter in the universe. However, in practice, antimatter is almost non-existent. It disappeared immediately after the Big Bang, and scientists still cannot explain why this happened. This paradox has become one of the main mysteries of modern physics, and many scientific myths and legends have been built around it, including those about mysterious laboratories that allegedly conducted secret research on antimatter in various countries, including the Soviet Union. Let's figure out what is true and what is fiction, and why the topic of antimatter still excites the minds of scientists and science enthusiasts. The history of the discovery of antiparticles began with theoretical calculations. In 1928, Paul Dirac, one of the greatest physicists of the 20th century, derived an equation that described the behavior of electrons. But this equation had an unexpected consequence. It predicted the existence of particles with the same properties as electrons, but with a positive charge. Dirac did not believe this result at first, but later acknowledged its reality. In 1932, American physicist Carl Anderson, while studying cosmic rays, discovered a particle that behaved like an electron, but moved in the opposite direction in a magnetic field. This was the discovery of the positron, the first antiparticle. This discovery revolutionized physics and confirmed Dirac's theory. In the years that followed, physicists discovered more and more antiparticles, antiprotons, antineutrons, and then antihydrogen atoms. It would seem that if every particle has an antiparticle, then there should be equal amounts of matter and antimatter in the universe. However, in practice, antimatter is almost non-existent. It disappeared immediately after the Big Bang, and scientists still cannot explain why this happened. This paradox has become one of the main mysteries of modern physics, and many scientific myths and legends have been built around it, including stories about mysterious laboratories that allegedly conducted secret research on antimatter in various countries, including the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was always surrounded by an aura of mystery, especially when it came to scientific research. During the Cold War and the arms race, many facilities and laboratories were indeed classified as top secret. However, rumors, legends, and even myths quickly arose around them, often bearing no resemblance to reality. One of the most famous examples was the so-called Death Laboratory, a toxicology laboratory created on the orders of People's Commissar Yagoda in 1935. Its main task was to create poisons and toxins for special operations. The laboratory was under the control of the NKVD and existed until the end of the Soviet Union, periodically changing its structure and focus. In the 1950s, attempts were made to create a truth serum, but no real success was achieved in this area. Nevertheless, it was precisely such facilities that became the source of rumors about top-secret experiments allegedly conducted on humans, although there is no documentary evidence of this. Another striking example is Field Research Laboratory Number 52, or PNIL 52. In reality, it was engaged in the study of bacteriological weapons, mainly strains of anthrax known to science. The laboratory was located in a remote area to minimize the risk to the population. Experiments were conducted on animals, not humans, and no breakthroughs occurred outside the test site. Nevertheless, conspiracy theorists and mystery enthusiasts began to spread legends about zombie viruses and microorganisms unknown to science that were allegedly being developed in this laboratory. Many Soviet scientific facilities were indeed highly classified. For example, Laboratory Number 2, created in April 1943 to develop atomic weapons, was under heavy guard. Many employees did not even know where they worked or what they were doing. After the collapse of the USSR, some of these facilities were declassified, while others remained a mystery to the public. Stories about underground cities and bases supposedly hidden in the mountains occupy a special place in mythology. For example, according to conspiracy theorists, there is a huge bunker for the country's leadership, or even an entire underground city under Mount Yamantau in the southern Urals, where strategic reserves are stored and top-secret experiments are conducted. In reality, the facility does exist and is of strategic importance, but there is no evidence of any antimatter laboratories or other fantastical projects there. Interestingly, myths about secret laboratories often arose around real facilities whose activities were indeed classified. This created a fertile ground for rumors, speculation, and even works of fiction. As a result, the real history of Soviet science became closely intertwined with myths and legends that still excite the minds of lovers of secrets and mysteries. Soviet high-energy physics developed rapidly, especially after the end of World War II. Shortly after the creation of atomic weapons, the country began actively building large scientific centers designed to study the fundamental properties of matter. One of the first such facilities was the synchrophasotron in Dubna, a unique installation that allowed elementary particles to be accelerated to enormous speeds. In the 1950s, Dubna became an international center for nuclear research, where not only Soviet but also foreign scientists worked. In the 1960s, construction began on another large accelerator in Protvino, near Moscow. A proton synchrotron was built here, which for a long time remained one of the most powerful in the world. It was in Protvino that Soviet physicists synthesized anti-helium-3 nuclei in the 1970s, which was an important achievement in the study of antimatter. These experiments used powerful magnetic systems that allowed antiparticles to be held for a short time, although not as long as modern traps at CERN. A large scientific center, the Budker Institute of Nuclear Physics, was also established in Novosibirsk. Here, new methods of particle acceleration were developed, and their interactions were studied. The Novosibirsk Center became an important part of the Soviet scientific infrastructure, providing both fundamental and applied research. All these facilities were shrouded in the strictest secrecy, which gave rise to many rumors and speculations. However, the actual research carried out in Dubna, Protvino, and Novosibirsk was aimed at studying the fundamental properties of matter and antimatter, not at creating fantastic devices or weapons. Nevertheless, it was around these centers that legends began to emerge about secret experiments and disappearing laboratories, which remain part of the modern myth about Soviet science. Antimatter occupies a special place in the world of science. It is both real and almost mystical, and a whole layer of myths, rumors, and conspiracy theories has formed around its research in the USSR. Antimatter is not just a scientific term, but a symbol of an unsolved mystery, intertwining the real achievements of physicists the secrecy of the Soviet era, and fantasies fueled by fear and a lack of information. In this chapter, we will examine how and why myths arose about secret laboratories that supposedly disappeared without a trace, and why the topic of antimatter became ideal fodder for conspiracy narratives. The Soviet Union was a country where secrecy was an integral part of the state structure. Scientific centers, especially those engaged in fundamental research, were always under the close scrutiny of the secret services. Official publications were carefully filtered, and any information about new discoveries or technologies often became state secrets. In such an atmosphere, even the most ordinary laboratories became shrouded in rumors, and real objects turned into legends. Ideological policy played a special role in the formation of myths. Soviet propaganda, on the one hand, emphasized the successes of science, while on the other hand, it concealed failures and dangerous experiments. This created an information vacuum that was quickly filled with rumors. For example, there were stories circulating among the people about laboratories where weapons of retribution were allegedly being created, antimatter was being developed to destroy cities, or experiments were being conducted that could change the course of history. Many of these stories had no basis in reality, but they fit perfectly into the atmosphere of total mistrust and fear of the unknown. One of the most enduring myths is associated with the disappearance of an antimatter laboratory in 1983. According to rumors, a group of scientists working in one of the Soviet Union's closed cities suddenly disappeared, along with the results of their research. Official documents were allegedly destroyed, and all witnesses were either transferred to other institutions or disappeared without a trace. This story is not confirmed by any archival documents, but it continues to live on in the popular imagination and is discussed on forums and in pseudoscientific publications. Why did antimatter become the focus of such legends? First, this substance does indeed have unique properties. When it collides with ordinary matter, it instantly annihilates, releasing enormous amounts of energy. Second, real experiments with antimatter were indeed conducted in the USSR, albeit not on the scale attributed to the myths. Thirdly, antimatter is an ideal subject for fantasies about superweapons, catastrophes, and disappearances, because its existence has been confirmed, but the details of how it works remain unclear to the general public. As a result, myths about secret laboratories and the disappearance of scientists became part of not only Soviet, but also global culture. They reflect not only the fears and hopes of society, but also the real problems of scientific communication, secrecy, and ideological control that still influence the perception of science in Russia and beyond. Conspiracy theories are an integral part of the history of any closed system, and the Soviet Union was no exception. Under conditions of total information control and strict censorship, any unusual events, the disappearance of a scientist, a fire in a laboratory, the sudden closure of a scientific center, immediately became fertile ground for rumors and speculation. People tried to explain the inexplicable with the most incredible theories, ranging from foreign intelligence interference to supernatural phenomena. Conspiracy theories had a special status in Soviet culture. On the one hand, state propaganda created an image of an external enemy that supposedly sought to destroy Soviet science and steal its secrets. On the other hand, real cases of espionage and betrayal fueled interest in secret operations. Against this backdrop, any rumors about secret laboratories, disappearances of scientists, or mysterious disasters were perceived as entirely plausible. Stories about scientific disasters that allegedly occurred due to failed experiments with antimatter held a special place. According to one popular version, in 1983, an explosion caused by the annihilation of antimatter occurred in one of the closed cities, after which the entire facility was destroyed and the information classified. In reality, none of the known scientific centers in the USSR recorded any such incidents, and all reports of disasters were based on rumors and hearsay. Conspiracy theories were often used as a tool in political struggles. Within the scientific community, they could serve as a way to discredit competitors or justify failures. In society, they were a way to explain incomprehensible events and express distrust of the authorities. After the collapse of the USSR, when some of the archives were declassified, it became clear that many of the most sensational stories had no basis in reality. But this did not prevent them from remaining in the popular consciousness. Thus, conspiracy narratives became an integral part of Soviet and post-Soviet culture. They reflect not only the peculiarities of the political system, but also the universal mechanisms of myth formation in conditions of information scarcity and high levels of distrust of official sources. The myth about the disappearance of an antimatter laboratory in 1983 is one of the most enduring and mysterious narratives of the late Soviet and post-Soviet era. Its details vary depending on the source. Some say it was a large scientific center in the Moscow region, others say it was a secret facility in Siberia, and still others say it was an underground complex in the Urals. But all versions have one thing in common: the sudden disappearance of a group of scientists, the complete destruction of documentation, and official silence from the authorities. Attempts to find confirmation of this myth have invariably come up against a brick wall of lack of facts. There is no mention of such events in any of the declassified archives or in the memoirs of actual participants in Soviet scientific projects. Moreover, in 1983, there was not a single major incident recorded at facilities where research on high-energy physics or antimatter was actually being conducted. All known laboratories in Protvino, Dubna, and Novosibirsk continued to operate as usual, and their employees regularly published scientific articles and participated in international conferences. So where did this myth come from? Its roots lie in the atmosphere of total secrecy that surrounded Soviet science. Any information about failures, accidents, or project closures was carefully concealed. This created fertile ground for rumors. If a laboratory suddenly disappeared from the public eye, it meant that something extraordinary had happened. In an environment where even the names of scientists could be classified and access to scientific publications was restricted, any anomaly quickly became the subject of speculation. The myth gained particular popularity in the 1990s when books and articles about the secrets of Soviet science were published en masse in Russia. The authors of these texts often referred to anonymous sources, retold rumors, or openly fantasized, mixing real facts with fictional details. As a result, the disappearance of the antimatter laboratory came to be perceived as a proven historical fact, although in reality, it was merely a reflection of collective fears and distrust of official versions. This myth is still discussed on forums, blogs, and even in some pseudoscientific films. It has become part of the cultural heritage of an era when the line between reality and fiction was particularly blurred. Soviet scientific centers such as Protvino, Dubna, and Novosibirsk were not only cutting-edge venues for research in high-energy physics, but also models of the highest secrecy. These cities were often not even marked on official maps, and their employees signed strict non-disclosure agreements. Any attempt to take information outside the facility could have serious consequences, including criminal prosecution. In Protvino, home to one of the world's largest particle accelerators, experiments with antiparticles were indeed conducted, but on a strictly scientific basis. International teams worked here, but the publication of results always had to go through several levels of approval. In Dubna, at the Joint Institute for Nuclear Research, fundamental experiments were also conducted, including the synthesis of antihelium and the search for new elementary particles. The Budker Institute in Novosibirsk was known for its developments in accelerator technology and plasma physics. Secrecy was so pervasive that even within the scientific community, information was extremely limited. Scientists from different laboratories could be unaware of their colleagues' parallel projects for years. This not only hindered the exchange of knowledge, but also contributed to rumors about missing laboratories and vanished scientists. After the collapse of the USSR, some of the archives were declassified, and it turned out that most of the rumors were unfounded. However, the atmosphere of secrecy in which Soviet scientists worked became the perfect environment for the emergence and consolidation of the most incredible myths, including the one about the antimatter laboratory that supposedly disappeared in 1983. The 1980s were a time when the world was living in a state of intense political and military confrontation. The Cold War between the USSR and the US had reached its peak, and scientific achievements became not only a source of national pride, but also a tool for strategic superiority. Any discovery in the field of physics, especially related to energy and new technologies, was instantly classified as top secret and considered a potential weapon. In this atmosphere, antimatter took a special place in the imagination of both military and civilian experts. In the West, there was active discussion about the possibility of creating antimatter weapons, hypothetical devices capable of releasing enormous amounts of energy through the annihilation of matter and antimatter. In the USSR, such topics were not officially raised, but rumors circulated within the scientific community about secret projects related to antimatter and possible attempts to create a new generation of superweapons. The country's political leadership viewed science as a critical element of national security. Large scientific centers such as Protvino, Dubna, and Novosibirsk were funded directly through defense agencies, and many projects had dual scientific and military purposes. This reinforced the atmosphere of secrecy and gave rise to additional rumors. If a laboratory suddenly disappeared or was closed, it meant that it was working on something so dangerous or important that the information could not even be shared with allies. The arms race and constant confrontation with the West created a special culture of mistrust and suspicion. Any leak of information could be seen as treason, and any unauthorized contact with foreigners as a potential threat to national security. In this environment, even ordinary scientific failures or organizational reshuffles could be interpreted as the result of catastrophic experiments or sabotage. As a result, the political context of the Cold War not only contributed to the development of science, but also became a catalyst for the emergence of numerous myths, rumors, and conspiracy theories. Stories about missing laboratories, vanished scientists, and top-secret experiments with antimatter fit perfectly into the general atmosphere of fear, mistrust, and search for hidden meanings. There were indeed objects in the history of Soviet science that became the source of many rumors and legends. Some of them were declassified after the collapse of the USSR, while others remain a mystery to the general public. For example, the famous Laboratory No. 2, created for work on the atomic project, was shrouded in the strictest secrecy for many years. The first Soviet nuclear weapons were developed here, and scientists worked in complete isolation from the outside world. A number of biological and chemical laboratories engaged in the development of new types of weapons suffered a similar fate. For example, a large center for the study of bacteriological weapons operated in the closed city of Kirovo-Chepetsk, and laboratories for the synthesis of new chemical compounds were located in Novosibirsk. All these facilities were characterized not only by a high level of secrecy, but also by a special access regime. Only specially vetted specialists were allowed to enter, and any information about the results of their work remained within the eye perimeter. Some laboratories did indeed disappear from the map of the country, most often as a result of reorganization, a change in profile, or liquidation after the completion of a project. However, none of the known cases are related to antimatter. All real disappearances had quite prosaic reasons: funding cuts, changes in scientific priorities, accidents, or staff leaving for work abroad. Nevertheless, each such story became the basis for new myths, in which the disappearance of the laboratory was explained not by bureaucratic decisions, but by mysterious disasters, secret experiments, or even the intervention of foreign special services. These examples show how easily real events can become legends if they are surrounded by an aura of mystery and ambiguity. In Soviet and post-Soviet culture, such stories are still popular, and their details become embellished with new details with each retelling. The spread of conspiracy theories in Russia is a phenomenon with deep historical and cultural roots. During the Soviet era, a lack of information, strict censorship, and the closed nature of scientific and state institutions created a unique environment in which any rumors and speculation quickly turned into enduring myths. After the collapse of the USSR, the situation changed only partially. The opening of archives and the publication of new data did not destroy conspiracy narratives, but, on the contrary, fueled interest in them. One of the main reasons for the popularity of conspiracy theories was the habit of explaining complex or incomprehensible events through hidden mechanisms and secret forces. In a situation where official sources of information were often distrusted and access to foreign data was limited, people sought alternative explanations. This applied not only to politics, but also to science. Any news about the closure of a laboratory, the disappearance of scientists, or unusual discoveries immediately became the subject of discussion in a small circle, and then grew into mass rumors. The media played a special role in spreading conspiracy theories. In the 1990s, on the wave of freedom of speech, many publications specializing in exposés, sensationalism, and pseudoscientific investigations appeared in Russia. Journalists and writers, unburdened by the need to confirm facts, actively exploited the theme of disappearing laboratories, mysterious experiments, and supernatural phenomena. The myth of the disappearance of the Antimatter laboratory in 1983 became one of the most popular stories, which was repeatedly reinterpreted and supplemented with new details. Popular culture also played an important role. Books, films, and television programs on mystical and pseudoscientific topics helped to reinforce the belief in the existence of hidden scientific projects and secret technologies. As a result, even those who were skeptical of the official versions were ready to believe the most incredible stories, especially if they were connected with the era of total secrecy and mysterious disappearances. Thus, the spread of conspiracy theories in Russia is not simply a consequence of historical circumstances, but also part of a national culture in which distrust of authority, an interest in mysteries, and a desire to find hidden meanings become the basis for creating and maintaining the most incredible myths. The mechanisms for forming and maintaining myths about Soviet science are closely linked to the peculiarities of the information space, ideological control, and the psychology of the mass consciousness. In the Soviet Union, official information was strictly rationed. Achievements were widely reported, while failures, accidents, and setbacks were either ignored or distorted. This created the impression that behind the facade of success, there was something more than the average person was allowed to know. One of the main mechanisms for the formation of myths was the information vacuum. When society does not receive reliable information, it begins to seek explanations on its own. Any anomaly, the sudden closure of a laboratory, the disappearance of a scientific team, rumors of unusual experiments, became a reason for the emergence of new versions. These versions were passed from mouth to mouth, became embellished with details, and over time turned into enduring legends. The second important factor was the active participation of the scientists themselves in creating a fog of war around their projects. Sometimes scientists deliberately exaggerated the significance or danger of their research in order to obtain additional funding or protection from outside interference. In other cases, laboratory staff fell victim to bureaucratic games. Information about the reorganization or closure of a facility was presented as the result of some disaster or external influence. The third mechanism was the influence of mass culture and the media. Books, films, and television programs about the mysteries of Soviet science not only popularized real achievements, but also actively exploited the theme of disappearing laboratories, mysterious experiments, and secret technologies. As a result, even skeptical citizens began to perceive myths as part of real history. The fourth mechanism is society's psychological need to explain the inexplicable. In conditions of uncertainty and fear of the future, people seek to find a logical, albeit fantastical, explanation for what is happening. This is how versions of a scientific conspiracy, Secret Service interference, or experiments with antimatter that have supposedly gotten out of control emerge. All this means that myths about Soviet science have lived on for decades, despite the emergence of new data and the declassification of archives. They become part of the collective memory, are supported by the media and popular culture, and are sometimes even used as a tool in political or ideological struggles. Ideological control was one of the key features of the Soviet system and had a powerful influence on all spheres of life, including science. Scientific research in the USSR was not simply regulated by the state. It was an integral part of the ideological machine aimed at strengthening power and maintaining the image of the country as a world superpower. This applied not only to the choice of priority areas, but also to the very structure of the scientific community, the methods of disseminating information, and even the formulation of scientific hypotheses. Under total control, any scientific achievements were presented as victories of the socialist system, while failures were either hushed up or explained away as the machinations of external enemies. Publications in scientific journals underwent multi-level censorship, and participation in international conferences was only possible for specially trusted individuals. Any contact with foreign colleagues was strictly monitored, and the exchange of information was limited to the official position. Ideological control was also evident in the formation of scientific myths. The country's leadership encouraged the creation of an image of Soviet science as the most advanced and heroic, capable of achieving the impossible. This led to real successes often being exaggerated, while failures and tragedies became taboo subjects. In such an atmosphere, even minor incidents could become shrouded in legend. If something was not officially mentioned, it meant that something dangerous or grandiose was hidden behind it. Stories about secret laboratories and disappearing scientists occupied a special place. The authorities could use such myths to strengthen internal cohesion, create an image of external threat, or divert attention from real problems. Sometimes scientists themselves became victims of ideological pressure. They were forced to sign non-disclosure agreements, had their contacts with colleagues restricted, and even had their personal correspondence monitored. As a result, ideological control not only hindered the development of science, but also became a catalyst for the emergence of persistent myths and conspiracy theories. These myths were supported at the state level, spread through official and unofficial channels, and over time became part of the collective consciousness, influencing the perception of Soviet science both within the country and abroad. In the Soviet system, secrecy and disinformation were not only tools of defense, but also active tactics for influencing the internal and external perception of the country. The principle of the best defense is attack manifested itself in the fact that the authorities not only concealed real information about scientific research, but also deliberately disseminated false or distorted data. This allowed them to confuse potential opponents, create a sense of exclusivity among the population, and reinforce the image of the USSR as a superpower with technologies inaccessible to other countries. One way of achieving this was to create information noise around particularly sensitive topics. For example, if rumors appeared in the Western press about Soviet experiments with antimatter, the Soviet media could either ignore the topic completely or publish deliberately exaggerated or fantastical stories that made it impossible to separate truth from fiction. This not only confused foreign intelligence services, but also gave Soviet citizens the impression that the country was on the verge of a scientific breakthrough, even if the research was actually in its early stages. Disinformation could also be used for internal struggles between scientific teams. Spreading rumors about the failure of competitors or their ties to foreign intelligence services allowed them to obtain additional resources and support from the leadership. In some cases, such campaigns led to real purges or the closure of laboratories, which only reinforced the atmosphere of suspicion and mistrust. Sometimes disinformation took the form of leaks, deliberately planted information about non-existent projects or disasters. Such stories quickly found their way into the Western media and then returned to the USSR in the form of foreign exposés, allowing the authorities to blame external enemies for spreading lies and tighten the screws of secrecy even further. As a result, the tactic of the best defense is a good offense not only protected real secrets, but also contributed to the emergence of new myths and conspiracy theories. It created a vicious circle in which truth, fiction, and disinformation were so intertwined that even decades later, it is impossible to separate one from the other. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, a process of declassification of many previously closed scientific facilities and archives began. This was made possible by political reforms, a change in the ideological climate, and public demand for the truth about the past. As a result, historians, journalists, and former employees of scientific centers gained access to a huge number of documents previously classified as top secret. Declassification made it possible to reconstruct the real picture of the activities of many laboratories and institutes. It turned out that most of the rumors about disasters, disappearances, and top-secret experiments had no basis in fact. For example, documents from Protvino, Dubna, and Novosibirsk showed that antimatter research was indeed being conducted, but within the framework of international scientific programs and under strict security controls. Descriptions of disappearing laboratories were most often explained by reorganization, funding cuts, or the transfer of personnel to other facilities. At the same time, declassification revealed real problems: accidents, bureaucratic conflicts, failed experiments, and even cases of unauthorized contact with foreigners. These facts helped to better understand how Soviet science worked and why so many myths and legends arose around it. Some declassified stories became the basis for new research, books, and documentaries that contributed to the demythologization of the Soviet past. However, even after the publication of authentic archival materials, many myths continue to live on. For part of society, they have become part of the cultural code, a symbol of lost greatness, or a reason for new conspiracy theories. Contemporary researchers note that the process of declassification is not only a path to historical truth, but also an important element in the fight against mass delusions and pseudoscientific narratives. Thus, the opening of archives and new scientific publications make it possible to separate fact from fiction. But it is not yet possible to completely dispel the myths about Soviet science. They continue to influence public consciousness, becoming part of the modern cultural and information environment. American experiments in the field of antimatter, like Japanese ones, were often the subject of rumors and conspiracy theories in the USSR. There was talk in the Soviet press and among the scientific community that the US had allegedly made a breakthrough in the creation of antimatter weapons or top-secret technologies capable of changing the balance of power in the world. These rumors were fueled by the real successes of American accelerator centers such as the Tevatron, but in reality, all experiments were part of international scientific programs and did not go beyond fundamental research. Soviet propaganda used information about foreign successes in two ways. On the one hand, it emphasized the achievements of competitors to stimulate its own scientists to make new discoveries. On the other hand, it spread disinformation about alleged black projects in the West that threatened the security of the USSR. As a result, the image of antimatter as a dangerous and mysterious substance around which an invisible war between scientists and special services was being waged became entrenched in the mass consciousness. Myths about Western laboratories, disappearing scientists, and classified disasters became part of the general background against which perceptions of Soviet science and its enemies were formed. These stories are still used in popular books, films, and online discussions, sustaining interest in the topic of antimatter and reinforcing belief in the existence of global scientific conspiracies. The technology for producing and storing antimatter is one of the most mysterious and mythologized topics in modern science. In the popular imagination, antimatter is often associated with fantastic sources of energy, weapons of incredible destructive power, and even the possibility of time travel. However, the reality is much more modest and complex. Antimatter does indeed exist and can be obtained in laboratory conditions, but its production and storage are fraught with enormous technical and financial difficulties. In the USSR, as in other countries, experiments to obtain antimatter were conducted on large accelerators. In Protvino, Dubna, and Novosibirsk, scientists synthesized individual antiparticles, positrons, antiprotons, and antihelium. However, the amount of antimatter obtained was negligible. Even a milligram of antimatter would require power that no laboratory in the world could provide. All the antimatter produced by humankind in its entire history does not exceed a few nanograms. The main problem is the storage of antimatter. Upon contact with ordinary matter, it instantly annihilates, releasing energy. To hold antiparticles, complex magnetic traps and vacuum systems are used, which require constant monitoring and huge costs. Even short-term storage of antiprotons or antihydrogen is the result of the work of international teams and cutting-edge technologies. Myths about antimatter banks and secret Soviet facilities where kilograms of antimatter were allegedly stored are completely unfounded. Such stories arose from a misunderstanding of real scientific achievements and a desire to give Soviet science an aura of supernaturalism. In practice, all experiments were limited to fundamental research, and there was no question of any industrial or military use of antimatter. Modern technologies allow antimatter to be produced and held only in microscopic quantities, enough for experiments in particle physics, but completely insufficient for creating energy sources or weapons. All talk of secret Soviet technologies in this field is nothing more than part of the mythology surrounding antimatter and its research. Antimatter has long been the subject of fears, exaggerations, and sensationalism. In popular culture, it is often portrayed as a source of incredible destructive power. Just think of science fiction films, novels, and pseudoscientific publications where antimatter is used to create bombs, interstellar engines, or even portals to other dimensions. However, the real dangers associated with antimatter are far less impressive than the imagination would have us believe. The main danger of antimatter is its instant annihilation upon contact with ordinary matter, accompanied by the release of enormous amounts of energy. But to obtain even a single gram of antimatter would require resources and power comparable to the energy of an entire country. Modern laboratories are only capable of synthesizing individual antiparticles, which are immediately destroyed upon the slightest contact with the walls of the trap. Myths about antimatter bombs or secret Soviet experiments with devastating consequences arose at the intersection of science fiction and the real achievements of physicists. In the USSR, as in the West, fundamental research was conducted, but none of the known projects went beyond laboratory experiments. All talk of disasters, explosions, or the disappearance of laboratories due to antimatter is nothing more than rumors and speculation. The real risks of working with antimatter are related to technical failures, vacuum breaches, or magnetic trap failures. In such cases, antiparticles simply annihilate, releasing a negligible amount of energy. Not enough to destroy laboratory equipment, let alone cause large-scale disasters. Thus, antimatter is not a weapon of the future or a source of apocalyptic threats, but a unique tool for understanding the fundamental laws of nature. All the fears and myths surrounding it are the result of misunderstanding and the desire to find a simple explanation for complex scientific phenomena. Myths and legends about antimatter, disappearing laboratories, and secret experiments have a significant impact on the public perception of science. On the one hand, they maintain interest in complex scientific topics, make physics and cosmology part of popular culture, and inspire young people to pursue scientific careers. On the other hand, the spread of unreliable information and pseudoscientific sensationalism creates distrust of the real achievements of scientists and hinders the popularization of genuine knowledge. In Soviet times, myths about secret laboratories were often used to strengthen patriotism and create an image of the country as a leader in science and technology. After the collapse of the USSR, these same stories became the basis for nostalgia for lost greatness and the search for hidden meanings in history. In modern Russia and abroad, such legends are actively exploited in books, films, television programs, and online discussions. Myths about disasters, disappearances, and top-secret technologies can lead to false expectations of science, disappointment in real results, and even the emergence of new conspiracy theories. They hinder objective discussion of scientific problems, complicate dialogue between scientists and society, and sometimes become a tool for manipulating public opinion. Nevertheless, myths are not only a source of misconceptions, but also an important part of cultural heritage. They reflect the fears, hopes, and dreams of society and serve as an indicator of the level of trust in science and authority. It is important for scientists and science communicators to be able to distinguish fact from fiction and use interest in myths as an opportunity to educate and explain real scientific achievements. Ultimately, the fate of myths about antimatter and disappearing laboratories depends on how openly and honestly science talks about its successes and failures, and how much society strives to seek the truth rather than simple and effective answers. Conclusions: what we know, what we don't know, and why it is important to separate facts from myths. The story of the myth about the disappearance of the antimatter laboratory in the USSR in 1983 is a vivid example of how, in conditions of secrecy, ideological control, and a lack of reliable information, the most incredible legends are born and live on for decades. Despite the fact that none of the declassified archives, scientists' memoirs, or modern scientific publications confirm the existence of such a laboratory or its disappearance, this story continues to stir the minds and inspire authors of books, films, and online discussions. The real facts show that antimatter is the greatest achievement of modern physics, but its production and storage remain at the level of fundamental laboratory experiments. Even in the 21st century, despite all the successes of CERN and other international centers, humanity is only capable of synthesizing nanograms of antimatter, and the cost of a single gram is estimated at tens of trillions of dollars. Any talk of secret Soviet technologies, antimatter banks, or disappearing laboratories is nothing more than the result of reinterpreting real scientific achievements through the prism of fear, mistrust, and a desire for sensationalism. Nevertheless, myths about Soviet secret laboratories and disappearing scientists are not only a cultural legacy of the era, but also an important indicator of society's attitude toward science, power, and truth. They show how much society needs honest dialogue between scientists and citizens, openness of scientific data, and education. Only by separating fact from fiction can we not only understand the past, but also avoid repeating mistakes in the future. Modern science continues to search for answers to fundamental questions about matter and antimatter, and the openness of the scientific process and the accessibility of information are becoming the keys to trust and progress. The story of the lost laboratory is a reminder of how easily reality can be distorted if society is unable to distinguish verified data from rumors and speculation.